For our next speaker, her educational leadership has likewise created its own way in Kalihi, and it is called the Farrington Way. As you walk through the Farrington High School campus, the bold signs and images are evidence of a prideful culture of excellence, the Farrington Way. Our next speaker has dedicated over 40 years to public education. She was a teacher at Nanapuli High School, a vice principal at Waianae High School for 15 years, principal at Olomana School and principal of Farrington High School for 15 years. She is the recipient of the Principal of the Year Award and the National Milken Educator Award, a most prestigious national award. I would say that one of my major contributions to education in Hawaii was hiring Catherine as my vice principal at Waianae High School. The rest is history. I'd like you to please welcome my dear friend and most esteemed educational leader in Hawaii, Catherine Payne.
The opportunity to do so much for Hawaii really rests in the hands of the many young people I see here today, and I'm grateful that you are here. It's humbling and an honor to be here, and I thank you for including me to share a bit about my experiences and perceptions, as Roberta said, over 40 years of work with students, teachers, and principals in Hawaii's public schools. I've truly had a wonderful career, and I'm so thankful to my colleagues and my mentors in the Department of Education who opened doors and encouraged me to take risks. They've allowed me to grow through professional experiences that I would never have imagined myself doing when I first stepped into a classroom as a beginning teacher. When I think about it, I believe I have been a teacher for longer than even I can remember. My mother told me that I started gathering my dolls around to conduct lessons when I was 2. And by the time I was 7, I had the younger children in the neighborhood in front of the blackboard, learning words and sharing stories. My grandmother taught in a one-room schoolhouse at the beginning of the last century. Until her death at 90, she spoke of how the children she worked with made a lasting impression in her life. I understand that now so much more than I did when she first talked to me about her experiences as a teacher. Now I know that it has been my students who shaped me as an educator, and it must continue to be the students whose young spirits and future well-being drive us to craft a public education system that supports them every day in the classroom. While I was a teacher of sorts throughout my childhood and adolescence, I dreamed of one day being a real teacher in a real school. I read books about inspirational teachers who made me want to be just like them. I was lucky to have encountered some wonderful teachers during my own journey through 15 schools before my high school graduation. They added to my conviction that the solution to all our problems was great teachers for every child and young person in the world. When I began my teaching career in the mid-1970s at Nanapuli High and Intermediate School, I was a starry-eyed idealist who believed that I would help transform our world by changing how we educated young people in our classrooms. Those of you old enough to remember the 1960s and 70s, those were years that had lots of alternative schools established. We had lots of new ideas that were often derided as New Age thinking, and New Age philosophies. And many of us who were pre-service teachers at that time were introduced to learning scenarios that had students working in groups to solve problems that did not have a single answer. Students were asked to examine their values and beliefs. That was a real issue in the 70s. And to defend them to others who had different convictions. Students were asked what they wanted to learn. Relevant, connected, hands-on learning experiences were part of our practice. And teachers got together to build interdisciplinary thematic units. When I was in the 10th grade, we had an interdisciplinary English and social studies and science and humanities curriculum. We talked a lot about the importance of self-esteem to academic success. That may have been our downfall, because self-esteem now is considered something that we should not be paying that much attention to. I don't agree. But perhaps we reached too far and overcorrected the traditional models of instruction during that time. Or perhaps these instructional strategies just did not align with the standardized testing that remained unchanged throughout this era when we endeavored to reach students in different and more personalized ways. We study history to learn lessons from the past that can inform the decisions we make for today and the future. Our public schools have been reforming for as long as I have been aware of what was happening. Some of the reforms have been major overhauls and others have been smaller adjustments. We've rarely let the dust settle long enough to fairly judge the impact of these changes on our students. Nothing has been all-encompassing as what we have now. As we came to the end of the 1970s, Hawaii and the nation heard over and over again that our public school graduates lacked the skills to be successful in college and employment. The movement back to basic, more traditional educational models began and was reinforced in 1983 when a nation at risk admonished the country for the poor education we were inflicting upon our students. In Hawaii, we took our low ranks in national testing very seriously. Similarly, our nation suffered in international comparisons. The response to what we were repeatedly told was a national crisis was tremendous growth in the education reform business. Advertisements for new curriculum, instruction, and assessment models with accompanying textbooks and later hardware and software and expensive consultants filled our mailboxes. It seemed like everyone had a deal for us that would excite kids, raise test scores, and make teaching easy. That's where I first heard the term teacher-proof lesson plans. Over the years, the education corporations began to merge with the testing companies until now just a few control the entire education package of curriculum, instruction, and assessment. For a while, Hawaii kept it local and crafted what was termed foundation program objectives along with course descriptions, objectives, and curriculum guides for all our secondary courses. We also used curriculum crafted and tested by the University Laboratory School that had a uniquely local slant. And I used some of that, and it was pretty good, and it seems to have disappeared. As we moved into the 1990s, the criticism of public schools continued, and the new idea was to give the private sector a chance to try their hands on what we in the public schools seemed unable to do. You've heard a lot of that from Diane Ravitch. For-profit and non-profit corporations began competing for public funds to open schools that would serve students who had previously attended public schools. I'm really proud that in Hawaii, most of our charter schools have really been a grassroots charter operation and not the kind of charters that Diane Ravitch is talking about. But other school districts reformed to the competitive model exemplified by schools of choice, where all public schools in a district would take applications and presumably the worst schools would languish, waiting for people to apply. And the overarching idea they told us was that this would create local control. And certainly we're in favor of that. Not in favor, am I, however, of how this was all done. But Hawaii did not ignore the national movements. The 1990s gave rise to our first charter schools, and for all regular schools, if you were around, you remember the optional school community-based management model with local school councils comprised of school staff and parents. And if we had schools that operated like that, we could request waivers from laws and Board of Education policy to do things differently. Later, this morphed into a non-optional school community council model, and we seem to have lost that option of requesting waivers from policy and law. I was fortunate to be a principal during the era when leadership at the state encouraged individual schools and complexes to try some ideas that might help address the unique needs of the school or the community. However, as federal mandates became more stringent, our state leadership became more constrained. While test scores, as measured by the Hawaii State Assessment, climbed steadily as teachers and students became accustomed to the standards and the tests, we began to see an erosion of programs in areas that were not tested. Schools with limited resources had to cut back on art and music and physical education and science and civics. Later, however, when science became part of the testing cycle, it regained a stronger place in our elementary curriculum. We test what we teach. And in the case of many of our children in poverty, since that was really stressed, the children who suffered the most because of the music loss and the art loss and the other kinds of experiences that only schools provide were the children in poverty. At the end of this first decade of this century, we embarked on a new assessment model that involved racing to the top in a few short years. New national standards and new assessments were put in place, and principals and teachers worked to incorporate Common Core into their programs. Budgets needed to be reprioritized as new textbooks and technology were needed that were specific to the required curriculum. Many experts were brought in to help train principals and teachers, not only in the Common Core, but in the new protocols of teacher evaluation that now included student performance on standardized tests. Schools lost almost all autonomy about their core mission of providing instruction to students. I retired just as this last phase was arriving, but I kept in close touch to all that is occurring through the work I continue to do in support of public schools. Over the last 5 years, I have observed schools restructuring around testing schedules. Kindergarten teachers are doing test prep with their students. I've heard this expression, laser focused, with respect to student achievement as measured by test scores, more times than I can count. And I am at the point where I would like to have this term banished from the vocabulary of new tests this past year were served up with the expectation that the scores would all adjust downward. But some came up and some went down. This is what generally happens whenever people are tested. We have a system where schools are ranked and labeled so that we will always have a cluster requiring the superintendent to take over the management operations. As we race to the top, we have built a structure where some schools will always be left behind. Principals tell me that their focus must be on implementing mandates and that they spend many days in training sessions each month. When they are in school, they are managing an academic plan, teaming with recent and new initiatives, and trying to help their faculties find ways to integrate and make connections of all this stuff. In some schools, the relationships have become fractured through the expectation that things just have to get done and no excuses will be tolerated. This is the tone of top-down leadership, and we are developing principals who only know that style of management. I worry that we are forgetting that public education is a people business, not a manufacturing assembly line, and that people skills are key to the success in many of the careers that students will move into when they graduate. How top management works with school leaders and how principals and teachers work with one another are the models our students see and learn how things are done. The state's Race to the Top plan and their strategic plan both reference support for schools. There has been some federal money directed to schools that are struggling the most, but in a considerable amount of these funds, there has been the hiring of private consultants to conduct workshops and trainings that we used to have the capacity to do within our own system. Many of these providers are from outside of our state, and the cost of bringing them here is substantial. This dependency on outside resources has weakened both the understanding of top management about the issues in our schools and the ability of those in resource positions to carry out the training needs that have been identified in the state plan. As our dependence on outside expertise to help teachers and principals has been costly for the school and the state, because the complex staffs have been severely cut, there is rarely direct help for schools. Schools are contracting themselves with outside providers. At the same time that these new initiatives have been raining on schools, direct support for schools has been restricted. District staffs used to have content specialists who helped teachers who were struggling and who helped principals with training that school staffs identified as necessary. Cadres of resource teachers used to be available to support schools with initiatives that were mandated, encouraged, or offered. We always had mandates in areas such as special education, programs for English language learners, and many other federal programs that are mandated. We'll never escape them completely. But we also had some menus of options we could consider for our schools, and there were human resources within our systems of complexes and districts to help. The primary responsibility of staff at district and state offices has changed to oversight of principals. And for example, principals who did not complete the number of teacher evaluations during the allotted time were sent reprimands. No excuses, just get it done. Accountability has been another loaded vocabulary word that is translated into severe consequences for not being in compliance with mandates. As the expense for oversight and investigations have grown, the resources for schools and classrooms has diminished. A great amount of time and resources are spent investigating allegations of non-compliance and misconduct, many of which could and should be handled between the supervisor and the employee. Again, this is a people business, and most of the time, we should be able to trust our complex and school leaders to work with the people for whom they are responsible to solve problems that arise. Frankly, if they cannot be trusted to handle this, they should not be in leadership positions. It is only the most serious that should rise to the level of state intervention and investigation. And even these should be promptly and fairly resolved without lives being put on hold for what, in some cases, has been years. We are in an era when what we know is in conflict with what we practice. When I was still a principal, the Department of Education office that conducts professional development for education leaders had us reading Michael Fullen's books on leadership. I gave copies of one of my favorites to my vice principals and to every teacher at Farrington who expressed an interest in moving from the classroom to administration. What's Worth Fighting For in the Principalship captures the core values and the capacities needed by school leaders. Fullen recognizes that leaders must be able to adapt to the pace of head-spinning changes in our world and in our schools, and to help those in the schools who also have to make these transitions. Lesson 1, he notes, is that you cannot mandate what matters. The more complex the change, the less it can be forced. A culture where mandates are expected and accepted without question or excuses leads to individuals in an organization who are dependent rather than self-reliant. We may be creating school administrators who are, by necessity, more focused on management and compliance compliance than on leadership. This does not bode well for the sustainability of change, even the changes that are good for schools and students. We also know that a great deal of what our students learn is not easily measured by standardized tests. There is a need for us to do some testing that gives us a picture of how our students are doing relative to the nation and the world. And we do that with the NAEP, and you heard about that earlier. And we also need assessment measures that help us to know how our students are doing in our state. But we do know that traditionally normed, bell-curved assessments are not good measures of student mastery. There are other valid measures that are being used elsewhere, some of which we flirted with in Hawaii before they were abandoned. Senior projects almost made it. Some schools worked really hard to build systems that would support these projects, but others did feel they were too onerous. And maybe that's true, because since capstones or senior projects were in addition to and not in place of other required tests, it was a huge hurdle. Digital portfolios were also promoted a few years back as part of what would be a routine aspect of our assessment. But that too became too burdensome, apparently. It does take time and support for initiatives like these to settle into schools that have been doing things in a traditional way for as long as we can remember. We do not have a good track record in Hawaii of sticking with things long enough to see whether they are effective. Standardized tests are efficient and comparatively cheap, although huge amounts of money have gone into them. They are likely to be required for some national and state accountability as we move forward. However, we need to take a hard look at whether these tests are giving us the information we need to do a better job with our students, or whether the time devoted to testing and test prep is taking away from actual instruction and learning. What is the least amount of bell curve tests we can do to satisfy broad accountability measures? The tests we use should assess what we determine is important for students to know and be able to do. When high-stakes testing takes over the curriculum, other learning experiences and outcomes we say are important get relegated to lower priority, or they disappear completely. We recognize the importance of developing students who are able to direct their own learning, who are thinking deeply and solving complex problems alone and with others. We want our students to contribute to the community, have understanding, empathy, respect for everyone, and be able to communicate effectively through speaking and writing. We want our students to identify and produce quality work across all the disciplines. But we seem to not be unable to measure these outcomes. And so we don't test them. There is a great deal of research on student assessment. We need to study what is already known and engage the expertise of our universities maybe in helping us understand the implications of the decisions we make. But we also need to talk with teachers and principals and students as we consider whether the statewide testing we are requiring is the best way to measure the quality of our schools and of our teachers. We need to ask whether these tests are the predictors of students' future success. And we need to face the reality of what high-stakes testing is doing to teachers and students and to the culture of our schools and to learning. We have calculated that the best payoff on the high-stakes test is to give a lot of support to what we refer to as tipping point students. Students whose initial test scores show that they are just under the cutoff. Helping these students move forward a bit will help the school's overall optics a great deal. Because improvements at the low end and the high end of the bell curve will do little to impact the school's ranking. Maybe we we should have a discussion on the ethics of this approach. Would it be possible in our system to have just enough standardized testing to satisfy the political accountability requirements? Could we then allow principals and teachers to propose assessments unique to their schools that would provide real-time feedback on student learning and real-world demonstrations that the students have mastered the concepts of the course? Some of our charter schools are developing innovative measures that are specific to their schools, and the larger system might learn from this. Some major changes in the thinking and approaches of state leadership will be required, but I believe that it is possible within the existing legal and political parameters, and at the very least, we have to get this discussion started. The word unique is used casually to describe many things that are not unique. But Hawaii is a unique state with a diverse collection of communities that are important to preserve. In most other school districts, you have a state history course a couple of times during that K-12 experience. But in Hawaii, it is so much more than that. Hawaiian culture and values are woven throughout our schools and communities, and the law provides for Hawaiian language, history, and culture education in all of our schools. In addition, we have significant populations of ethnic groups from all over the world, particularly from the Pacific Rim. The rich diversity of language and culture in our island communities is our most valuable resource. Our public school system has part of the responsibility of protecting this resource. To do this, we must recognize that different communities and individual schools must craft educational programs that ensure that all students will accomplish the important learning standards and social and personal outcomes we want for all students in our state. For this to happen, we must start with our schools. For one thing, we might begin by watching the language we use when we talk about our public schools. Language which often compares working in a public school to fighting a war. Teachers and principals are on the front lines and in the trenches. Nobody talks about private schools like that. And that alone sets a tone that is not helpful in moving us forward. We need to expect that our principals and teachers have the professionalism and expertise to make the right decisions for their schools. If they do not, we should be providing them with the kind of support that will help them develop as effective teachers and leaders. The right kind of supportive leadership in the system will help principals and teachers understand that leadership is not about power over an organization or a classroom. Leadership is about divesting power throughout the entire system and trusting the people in the system to do their best and ask for support when they need it. I was fortunate at Farrington to have been allowed to redesign our large campus into academies focused around a career or an academic theme. We made huge changes that have been sustained because the teacher leaders were involved in creating and planning the changes. We built this model after studying the research on effective secondary programs, particularly Tony Wagner's work that stressed a different 3 R's: rigor, relevance, and relationships. This was one of the initiatives of the Department of Education that was offered and that we grabbed and worked with. The department has moved on, but there is something some schools have stuck with. They've realized that this work, particularly at high schools, brings learning to the child, to the student, that is meaningful. And it helped the schools and continues to help schools create good programs for their kids. We've tried top-down management, and it has succeeded. What if we expected them to lead collaboration in their schools over all matters related to student learning? Could we shift things so that the majority of principals' time is spent leading and supporting teachers and less time managing and monitoring them? What if we changed our expectations of complex and district support staff so that they would be spending most of their time providing direct support to schools? They would be asking, what do you want for your school? How can I help? What do you need? I don't support the elimination of all state office functions, but what I do support is a redefining of those functions so that every employee at that level understands that the sole reason for the position is to support the work that is done in schools. Understanding the work of schools and how the state and complex positions affect that work is crucial to change. There is still acknowledgement of the big silos in the Department of Education, people in departments and offices who do not communicate well with other departments or with one another, and where people lack an understanding of how they fit into the larger mission of the system. What is most lacking is an understanding of what happens in schools every day that must be handled by teachers and principals and support staff. During my last semester as principal, I remember that the State Technology Office sent out a demand that all special education teacher laptops had to be sent in by mid-April. Since they were leased and had to be returned by the end of June, the state office needed to inventory them. This is a stark example of people in a state office having no idea about the necessity of people in the schools having access to this vital piece of equipment until the end of the school year. A large outcry from the schools resulted in the cancellation of the memo, but it did not happen quickly, and it caused a lot of anxiety and anger. It need not have happened at all if the people in that office had talked to the schools. I recall being shadowed once by a local businessman who showed up promptly at 7 a.m. but left early, exhausted, around 4:30, when I was getting ready to meet with my administrative team before going to the basketball game. He called me the next day saying that he had no idea it would be such a rough day. Actually, he had no idea that it had been a really easy day. No screaming parents, no IEPs. Schools do not have normal days, and those who support the folks in the schools need to understand that while everyone has a job to do, the first part of everyone's job description should be a statement that connects their work to students. Let's start asking the questions and having the conversation with local communities, principals, teachers, and parents about how we can craft a system that puts the development of students as learners and citizens in the hands of those who are closest to our classrooms. If we know that learning is best understood through the integration of academic subjects that include science, humanities, the arts, civic education, and technology, how can we support schools and classrooms for all children where this happens? If we know that the best assessment measures are those where students demonstrate that they have mastered complex ideas through real-world projects, how can we support schools that would like to try this in place of some of the standardized tests? I have great hope for what is possible, and I know that we have teachers and school leaders who can be trusted to work with our schools and communities to build a public education culture that brings the knowledge we already have about teaching, learning, and leadership to our children and our schools. The transition will not be easy, but I believe that once we are able to accomplish this, we will have a public education system that honors our children, our families, and our unique collection of islands that is Hawaii. Thank you.